Good morning. Let's get ready with me and let's talk about how trauma intersects with authenticity and spirituality. What do you think? Okay, so a couple things. If this doesn't resonate with you, it's okay. We're going to kind of do a little practical magic here, but you take what you want, you leave what you don't. This is not, I don't have all the answers. I think some of us who refer to ourselves as sort of intuitive beings are getting some information, and I like to kind of find the intersection between spirituality, humanity, and practicality. So my jam is kind of authenticity, which is, I think, more or less the totality of who a human being is. Everybody's both shadow and light. And as this massive awakening is happening on this planet right now, I just want to walk you through how I see it, and maybe it'll help and maybe it won't. Either way, no worries. Okay, so my name is Trish Law. I'm a life coach, trauma informed. And that's not really what I do. What I help people do is remember who they are. I believe that authenticity is the highest frequency on the planet. So if you're into that 3D, 5D, if you want to know the bridge from the 3D world to the 5D world, it is absolutely through authenticity. And trauma is part of your authenticity. So first and foremost, if we're going to make the claim that spirituality and trauma are linked, let's define what trauma is. Okay, so trauma, the way I look at it, is kind of like an emotional form of constipation, if you will. Basically, it's the totality of things that happened to you, things that should have happened, quotation mark, and didn't, and unmet emotional needs, right? So trauma is not just what happens to us, it's what should have happened that didn't, but more importantly, trauma is what happens inside of us. So basically, that's a real quick definition of trauma. Okay, so in understanding authenticity, you have to understand trauma. And trauma is all this stuck emotion. And it's the times where we betrayed ourselves, the times where we said yes when we meant no, the times that we traded in our spirit in exchange for our certainty, that we were sort of led away from the truth of who we were in exchange for acceptance in our family structure, society, the world. In other words, trauma is, sort of projections and things that happen to us by interacting with others, and also having to adapt to a world that is certainly not set up for authenticity. It's set up for codependency and compliance. So trauma is basically the things that we didn't fully feel, right? And so you don't feel, you can't heal. And so it's kind of like everything gets stuffed in the body. That's where trauma goes. So trauma is this emotional experience that's an amalgamation of everything from shame to guilt, to grief, to apathy, to fear and anger and pride and anxiety and all these things that are the reality of being a human. We don't often hear people talking about enlightenment, as a way of being, but we have plenty of tea in the trauma realm. Everybody's got a story about their emotional experience, which is the entanglement of all these emotions that are sort of formed as trauma in the nervous system that never get fully felt. They just kind of get stuck. This is important to understand. So if you have a lot of unprocessed trauma, which most of us do, we are automatically relegated to what we refer to as survival mode, right? So if you haven't processed your trauma, I guarantee you're there. And survival mode has nothing to do with your financial circumstances. It has everything to do with your living situation emotionally. So I work with all kinds of people all over the world, and I have people that are in poverty that are in survival mode, and I work with 2 billionaires that are also in survival mode. So it has nothing to do with race or anything like that. In fact, somebody that's in power, that's in survival mode, is going to be codependent with somebody who is disempowered, who is also in survival mode. So you see, it's like a little dance, but survival mode is the emotional experiences that we have, everything from shame, guilt, grief, apathy, fear, anger, pride, and everything in between. Does that make sense? That we've never fully acknowledged. So if that's the case, our brains codify trauma, which is this unfelt, stuck, unprocessed emotion, which is basically a ton of self-betrayal and a lot of trading in our spirit in exchange for certainty and identity, that this becomes normal and this becomes certain and this becomes our sort of baseline, right? So our brains are geared towards certainty. So if we have unprocessed trauma, that emotional experience that I just explained is certainty. That is your home. That is your emotional home. And this is important because your personality gets developed in trauma, in survival mode. In other words, as you're going through survival mode, you're figuring out ways to navigate that. And the byproduct of navigating that is your personality, right? Some people are perfectionists, some people are fuck-ups, and there's this broad spectrum of people in between. Obviously, family environments have a lot to do with this. The roles you take in your family, I'm just keeping it simple, but let's just call it identity, right? So your identity is developing as you're navigating trauma so that you can create some coping strategies and establish two things, relevance and certainty, and that equals your personality. So I guess your question is like, how does this intersect with spirituality? What the fuck does that, okay, great, I get it, right? We get it. Survival mode equals identity. Survival mode equals development of personality, development of the ego, right? So if we have an ego and we're going through a great awakening, like what does that mean? How do we be human and go through trauma, but also become a spiritually aligned being at the same time? Well, it's kind of a paradox. But this is what's happening all over the planet right now as people are beginning to wake up. Three-dimensional consciousness is in that survival mode paradigm, right? So you've heard people talk about timeline shifts. Survival mode is a timeline. It's a reality, right? Most people are in that reality right now. I think the majority of people are there, but you can see that people are starting to wake up. It's almost like they took some spiritual smelling salts and they're like, what the fuck is actually happening? What is happening? And they're getting information from God knows where, and they're beginning to question things. They're beginning to question the certainties. They're beginning to see through the bullshit. They're beginning to lift the veil. So here's the thing. Really hard to do this ascension process if you haven't acknowledged your trauma, right? It's a very insidious thing. It's crazy. So with the people that are sort of going through this awakening process, what we're referring to as healing is they're looking at their emotional experiences differently than they used to. They begin to process them. They begin to feel them. Here's the byproduct of beginning to feel your feelings. Two bonuses. Number one, you're going to begin to heal. And truthfully, it's not easy at first. It's very intense because if you haven't taken a shit, say for, 40 years, and you've repressed all of that stuff, it makes sense that it's not going to be pleasant as it begins to process and come out. Can we agree? So emotionally, that's the first stage of healing. Typically, it's very intense and you feel a little bit worse before you feel better. But then all of a sudden, things start to look very different. And you start to receive different bits of information. So you're only going to go as high in terms of your spiritual awakening into five-dimensional consciousness as far as you're willing to go low and deep down into your trauma, right? So your ascension is directly related to your ability to descend. This is why people that are very in tune with their feelings and have had a lot of trauma and processed it are highly intuitive. It's kind of like this weird paradox, right? And once you get above survival mode, you get a little bit higher up, like through courage or compassion, you start healing, you start to think differently. You start to see the world differently. You start to go from black and white to color. It's a very trust the process sort of thing. But people in the spiritual community definitely understand this, right? So you start to wake up. You start to become conscious. You start to realize that like my fear is really just habitual. And the identity that I've assumed to navigate my fear and shame in the past is the thing actually perpetuating it. And then you're like, I'm going to fucking stop doing that. And you start to realize that your life begins to transform. It may not look all that different on the outside, but it feels totally different. And you feel totally different on how you interact with it on the inside. And I've said this before, healing is not necessarily about feeling better, although that is definitely a byproduct coming from 3D to 5D consciousness. The point of healing is to get better at feeling. That's the point of it. So you can tap into your intuition and make that ascension from the low-level survival paradigm up to those higher levels of consciousness.